Semitism. The attempt to destroy or weaken the state of Israel, God forbid, which threatens the safety and well-being of the millions of Jews living in the Holy Land. They say a joke that there were terrorists who captured 3 individuals, and they offered each one of them a final wish before they executed them live on camera. So one of them was an American boy, a CNN reporter, and he said, before I die, I'd like to have one last good American meal. I'd like a cheeseburger and fries. It's a joke.
Oh, God.
Cheeseburger and fries. The next one is a BBC reporter, and he asks that he's a journalist down to his bones. He asked that he should be allowed to record this last interaction with the terrorists and ship it off to London to the BBC headquarters, and they'll be able to do a story on it. And the last person was an Israeli ex-commando, and he asked for them to come and kick him very hard in the stomach. Mm-hmm. So the terrorists, okay, fine, whatever, you want to get kicked in the stomach? They come over, they kick the Israeli in the stomach. As he's writhing around on the floor in pain, he grabs a pistol out of his sock, and he, what would be a good, neutralizes the terrorists. Neutralizes the terrorists, saves the day, and all 3 captives are free to go back home, safe and secure. So the 2 reporters who were with him, the other 2 people, like, if you had the gun in your sock the entire time, why did you tell them you got to get kicked in the stomach first before you saved us? He said, what? Then you should report that I was the aggressor. Yeah. So we have a very important topic to talk about today. Israeli directed anti-Semitism. And if you pay any attention at all to international news, chances are that you've heard something about Israel, even on a day-to-day basis. Mm-hmm. And more often than not, the report on the international news will be ugly and vilifying of the Jewish state. And in fact, if you just go by the news, you think that Israel is the worst country in the world. We're actually going to show a video in a couple of minutes that does a good job of showing the UN's issues with Israel. And you watch it, and if you actually contextualize it, it's actually shocking, and it's a little bit horrifying. That people say that not only is Israel the worst country, the most horrible violator of human rights, it's an apartheid state, occupiers, terrorists, they deserve to be subject to boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, in other terms, BDS. And all too often, that's the image of Israel as it's portrayed in our society. Mm-hmm. What we're going to focus on really today is why it is that so many Jewish people, especially young Jewish people, particularly on campus, which is actually why I thought it would be helpful if Sophia was here, because she's actually still living that life on campus, mm-hmm. Particularly on college campuses and like more and more Jewish youth are involved in the movements against Israel. So why that is and what we could do about that. So I'd like to actually start with that video, which shows the UN's bias against Israel. 1 second, I'm just gonna share my screen. So those of you at home can watch it. Here we go, 1 second. Okay. One second. This one. Okay. Oh, great. I don't know what it's loading now, but we'll give it a second.
And that's on that wall outside the UN.
Yeah, they call it the Isaiah wall. It's actually a quote from Isaiah. And okay, maybe not. Nope. What is happening here? We'll give it another 10 seconds. If it doesn't work, we'll just make the basic points. Okay. So it's completely queued up. Why isn't it? Okay, it doesn't want to work. Can't hold it against the computer. It's doing its best. Okay, but basically the basic idea of the video is that you have the UN headquarters. Oh, are you kidding me? But now I stopped the share. Now you see it's still frozen. This is very weird. Okay, we'll have to skip the video for today. I guess I'll add it to the recap email so you can watch it later on. But the basic idea behind the video is that you have the United Nations, and the idea of the United Nations, at least hypothetically, is actually a great cause. The United Nations came from the ashes of the two great world wars. The idea that all the nations should be united and form a world of peace and of harmony. But they have all the figures. I don't know all the figures by heart. If you actually read the statistics on the UN's condemnations of Eretz Israel, of the land of Israel, it's actually wild. It's off the charts, bizarrely. 90% of all sanctions against a specific nation state have been against Israel in general assemblies. An emergency session of the General Assembly is an incredibly rare thing to be done, and it's only ever been called to address Israeli violations of human rights. Other aggressors, Israel is condemned as much as other known violators of human rights, such as Iran, Cuba, Syria, Russia, and China combined. China actually somehow doesn't get any condemnations whatsoever. We could probably all know what that's about. But I don't think any of us really need to watch the video to know this to be true, that the bias against Israel, against the land of Israel, the country of Israel, is rampant both within the media and within the United Nations. So what is it about anti-Semitism? Why is the anti-Semitism now so focused on the state of Israel?
Well, because it's the modern form of anti-Semitism that's popular.
Perfect, exactly. That's the exact point. Rabbi Sachs, actually, we mentioned Rabbi Sachs, his first yard site just passed recently. He compares it to a virus, right? The virus mutates, right? The human, what's the defense system called? Yeah, you can read it in a second. What's our immune system is very good at its job. So what does a virus do when it goes up against the defense of the immune system? It mutates, right? That's why you have the alpha, beta, gamma, delta variants of the coronavirus, because the virus always changes, right? So Rabbi Sachs compares anti-Semitism to a virus. And Shalom, if you could please read, we're reading text 1 on page 84. Shalom, if you could do it loudly, please, that would be great.
Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in so doing, defeats the immune systems set up by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimization in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. That is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige, and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race, eugenics. And by the late century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, the supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews or the Jewish state are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity.
So Rabbi Sachs is basically saying exactly what Shalom said. Anti-Semitism is a baseless hatred, but in every generation, the virus, so to speak, mutates to glom on to the premier movement, theology. Concern is a good word, facing the world. So for much of recorded history, that was religion. So Jews, both in the West, in European countries, and in the Middle East, were faced at religious anti-Semitism, whether the Christ killer, the rejection of Muhammad. That was what most anti-Semitism was based around. Then when religion started fading away after the Renaissance, and definitely after the Industrial Revolution, anti-Semitism focused itself on science. That's what the Holocaust was the culmination of centuries of anti-Semitism, but they blamed it, so to speak, on science, racial science. Truth is, we shouldn't use the word science, pseudoscience, but still, they claimed it was science. And nowadays, where science has lost some of its shine, now the premier cause in some circles, not all circles, is the idea of human rights. So now Jews are accused of being the biggest violators of human rights. Israel is an apartheid state, it's an occupying force, they deny human rights, and crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, right? So that's how anti-Semitism gloms itself onto its hatred towards Israel and robes itself, so to speak, in attacks on Israel. So now an important question is, does that mean that all criticism of Israel is illegitimate? That all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic? What do you think?
No, I'm very critical of Israel.
Actually, we could go around the table. Are you a supporter of Israel?
Oh, definitely.
Do you criticize Israel? Do you agree with all its policies or all its politicians?
No.
Hillel, do you support the state of Israel?
Sure.
Or do you agree with all its policies and politicians?
I'm not so familiar. I can't say.
Do you have any critiques of the state of
No,
Israel?
I have none. I'm not personally.
Okay, that's fine. Jimmy,
I'm just going to, and I don't critique.
you don't have any critiques.
Even though there should be, I don't, because you need the yin and yang.
Okay, no. So you want to be a defender primarily?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
Anybody at home? Susie, what do you see yourself as a supporter of the state of Israel?
I don't live there, so I cannot criticize them. I cannot.
What? She doesn't live there, so she can't criticize. Well, one of the great things about Jews in general is that we find it within ourselves to criticize others, even if we don't necessarily have the experience that we need. Exactly. Yes,
What?
I don't- I don't think
What
it's,
is she?
she's saying she doesn't live in France. She can still criticize the French. You know?
Yeah, I could, but I can't tell them how to run the government when I don't live there.
Well, I consider myself a supporter of the state of Israel, and I have a lot of critiques very personally. And if you look on your books on page 87, they actually have statistics on this that 59% of all Jewish Americans consider themselves pro-Israel, but critical of at least some government policies, right? That I think most American Jews don't feel that every policy, and definitely not every politician, every administration in Israel, every political regime is 100% optimal. And I don't think there's a problem with that personally. Optimal. I mean, we talk about the Rebbe a lot, but the Rebbe was a staunch defender of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And the Rebbe publicly sometimes, when it came to certain regards, criticized some policies of the Israeli state. So how exactly do we differentiate between legitimate attacks or criticisms of the state of Israel versus illegitimate hatred, which is anti-Semitism? What do you think?
Well, I always believe in objective information, facts.
Okay.
You know, and where there's no emotion involved.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? How do you differentiate between a legitimate critique? I mean, put it this way, everyone has a mother, right? We hope those that are close to us give constructive criticism, right? Criticism doesn't have to get in the way. Not every time somebody gives you a criticism doesn't mean they hate you, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be room, I think, to criticize Israel in a constructive way.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you make sure that when somebody, even a non-Jew, not even, we're saying everyone, there has to be a difference between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism.
Another thing is that the standards
Oh,
are
that's
the
a good one.
same for everybody.
Yes, yeah.
If you're going to criticize Israel, then criticize China with Tibet.
Yeah, but the criticism, it seems to me, and that's why I say I wouldn't criticize it. Every time the criticism of Israel comes, it becomes a deconstruct. Well, when you criticize France, we assume France is there, and we're going to just change the thing. But every time you criticize Israel, it's taking away from it. It's not adding to it.
We're actually going to see that's both of your points are points we're going to make. That's like nobody says that France doesn't have a right to exist because of what happened in the Basque country, right? Nobody says that, or that China should fall down from the river to the sea because of its policies towards Tibet. It has problems, so we should deal with those problems.
I don't even think that.
The reason why I think it's important to delineate between criticism and anti-Semitism is there are certain people who have a problem. I found that in certain Jews also. It's like kind of like the boy that cried wolf. If everything is anti-Semitism, then nothing's actually anti-Semitism, right? If we just take a broad brush and say, anytime you look at Israel and don't like what you see, it's anti-Semitism, then nothing is anti-Semitism, right? Nobody's going to take you seriously anymore. You see anti-Semitism on every rock. So I think we need to have a clear definition of what is legitimate criticism and what crosses the line into anti-Semitism.
I-
And sorry, hello, go ahead.
So since fortuitously we talked about human rights as being the focus for
Sorry, guys.
nowadays for anti-Semitism, or the lens through which people look at anti-Semitism, I think that, I mean, I'm an expert. When people criticize Israel, they are basing it on, even when they criticize it on a human rights basis, they are using the lens of Jewish values. I think. I don't think it's inseparable. I think it's part and parcel of who inhabits Israel. And even though it's a secular state, quote unquote, I mean, still, I think the criticisms that come today about Israel are based on human values which come from the Torah.
Say the whole idea of
So-
human dignity is sourced in
Right.
Genesis.
Right.
So they used
So unfortunately, it always leads back to what you should be doing better. You're the source of these values that we hold dear. So it's kind of, you can't escape it in a way. You can't, I don't know if there is a way to criticize Israel without, by extension, going to anti-Semitism.
Right, now, if I say, all right, I criticize Israel, I criticize in the city of Lod, the Arabs have been shooting each other, there's gangs doing that now.
Mhm.
Now, people wouldn't say that was a criticism of Israel, because I'm using the Israeli Arabs as a thing. It's always when you say criticism of Israel, it seems the Jewish Israel. That's
Yeah,
being criticized.
yeah, for sure.
You know, if you go to an Arab town or Bedouin town,
Okay. I think we're getting a little bit off topic, but hello, I hope we're going to address what you're saying. And if we don't, remind me at the end of class and we'll talk about that.
I think what you say needs emphasis.
yes,
Every one of these things, these viruses that ended, with Jews persecuted and massacred, denied the right to. It always led that you don't believe in other gods. Yeah, I mean, you don't believe like that's in paganism.
Mhm.
You should die. You killed Jesus. You should die. You are a nation among nations. You should die.
You're saying it's
Your
not like we
blood-
should have a debate, just shoot you and be done with it.
No, but I'm saying that they
Yeah.
don't want to debate.
Right.
They think your blood isn't pure enough. You should die.
Right.
Now you don't practice human rights. You should die, or
Right.
else just leave the country. We cannot. They deny us solidarity. That's what they do,
Self-determination.
and life.
Yeah.
And so yeah.
So the first formula that we have for differentiating between anti-Semitism and legitimate critique of policies and politicians in Israel is what M. Shalom said. This actually comes from the Medrash. This is at least 1800 years old, this particular Medrash. It's a story about Hadrian. Now, Hadrian was a Roman emperor who lived during the 1st century of the Common Era, and his regime over the land of Israel was brutal. He actually put down the Bar Kokhba revolt, and when we read on Yom Kippur about the 10 martyrs, he was the perpetuator of those atrocities. He also he banned study of Torah. This is totally parenthetical. We say the Haftorah in Shul. The reason we read the Haftorah in Shul is during Hadrian's rule, after he stamped out the Bar Kokhba revolt, he outlawed the reading of the Torah publicly. So Jews couldn't read from the Torah publicly, so they read for whatever reason, the prophets and the writings were not part of that ban.
on Tuesday.
No, on Shabbat.
On
Instead of
Shabbat.
reading the Torah on Shabbat, they read the Haftorah. So after we were able to read the Torah again, we started reading the Haftorah as well. But he outlawed circumcision, he outlawed Shabbos observance. And there's a story told in the Medrash about a man who wrote to Hadrian. And I'm actually going to read this text, if you don't mind. We are on page 88. Imikantron wrote to Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision that you hate, Arabian tribes also circumcise. If it is Shabbat observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. Clear then you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment from you. So this man, Imikantron, we actually don't know who he is. I saw most commentators are of the opinion that it's actually a pseudonym. And Hadrian was incensed when he read this, and he actually tried finding the man, and he couldn't find the man. He tried to execute the man. But the idea was that Hadrian used to justify his brutal behavior towards the Jewish people by pointing that they have certain practices that are against his Hellenistic values. They mutilate the body, right? In Hellenism, the human body was a gift from the gods. The form is beautiful, and you have to respect it. So circumcision is a mutilation of the human body. We've got to persecute the Jews for that. So this Imikantron points out that the Arabian tribes also perform circumcision, right?
Did they?
Yes, the children of
Before-
Ishmael
before
before the advent of
Muhammad?
Muhammad. Yeah.
Oh, they did.
They took that on. That was an Arabian tradition, not a Muslim tradition.
Oh, I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Um, certain Arabian nomadic tribes circumcised all throughout the years. And if it's Shabbat, then the Kuthians were a tribe of people who converted to Judaism, but not wholly, and they ended up splitting from the Jews. But they also kept Shabbat. So if your problem with is Shabbos, he had a problem with Shabbos because another Hellenistic value was industry, hard work, being productive. And here you have the Jews 1 day a week, they're sitting at home and they're laying around, they're doing nothing, right? So the lazy Jews have a problem with that, so we got to persecute them. So the Simon Contra points out the Kuthians also kept Shabbos. So it's obvious that that's not the issue. You hate the Jewish people. You blame it on these practices. It has nothing to do. That's not where your hatred comes from. And that's it. So his first idea, the first idea we see is that the best way, one good way, one formula to determine if this is a legitimate criticism of the Jewish people or not, is a double standard test. Are you treating everybody, painting everybody with the same brush? And in modern times, Natan Sharansky, we mentioned him, I think, in the first class. Natan Sharansky, the famous Russian refusenik, he developed the 3D test, he called it, to distinguish between legitimate criticism and anti-Semitic criticism of Israel. And one of them actually kind of is sourced, at least conceptually, in the medrash we just read. Hillel, could you do me a favor, please, of reading text 3? And actually, before you do, another idea that's, there's a story that kind of shows this double standard idea. Back in the 20s, the president of Harvard was a man by the name of A. Lawrence Howell. And he tried to limit the number of Jews admitted to his university, to Harvard. They said Jews cheat. Jews cheat, so I don't want Jews to come in. So one of his distinguished alumnus objected on the grounds that everyone cheats. There's no evidence that more Jews cheat than anyone else. So Howell responds, you're changing the subject, I'm talking about the Jews.
Right?
So that's the first idea, the double standard test. Hillel, do me a favor, read the rest of the 3D test.
The first D is test of demonization when the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sense of proportions, when comparisons are made between Israel's and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps in Auschwitz. This is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. Second D is a test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, when the behavior of known and major abusers such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria is ignored, when Israel's Magen David Adom, alone among the world's ambulance services, is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied alone among all peoples in the world, this too is anti-Semitism.
So can you be respectful and even a lover of the Jewish people and still criticize the state of Israel? I believe that is true. But once the language that you're using strays into demonization, calling the Israeli government Nazis and comparing the refugee camps to Auschwitz, and when you start using double standards, again, most of the people who are marching are not going and having protests about the camps, the Uyghur camps in China, or about the state of affairs in Tibet, or what India is doing with its Muslim population. When you have a double standard, that's already going into another field. When everything becomes about Israel also, that also is not a legitimate criticism. I actually saw a picture, there was a climate march. I think it was last Sunday, maybe? Was there a climate day?
Yeah, because of that whole glass.
But one was, so there was a march, there was a protest, and somebody had a sign, Palestinian rights are a climate issue. So at that point, now we're jumping the shark. It has nothing to do with what we're discussing, right? That's not a legitimate criticism of Israel. And finally, hello, you have to say it for me, the
Delegitimization.
Exactly. When you say that, it's not that you have a problem and we should solve the problem and address that issue, but rather from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, and Israel does not have a right to exist, then we're no longer discussing criticism of Israel. Now we're jumping into anti-Semitism that is just garbing itself in the robe of
Human rights.
human rights. Exactly. So now that we have a better understanding about this third wave, so to speak, or this Delta variant of anti-Semitism, which is criticism of hatred of Israel. So what do we do about it? Actually, before we do that, anyone have any questions? Anyone?
I want to stress again that the human rights issue is more complicated than the religion and the science issue, pseudoscience. it's more complicated. Hopefully we'll dive into that.
I think Israel can work. Before we move on, I do think Israel can work on some of its human rights. I guess track record. There's certain things it could do better. 100%. I think this, as a Fruma Jew, as an Orthodox Jew who supports the land of Eretz Yisrael, who thinks every Jew has to do whatever they can to support Eretz Yisrael, but they can work on it. All right. But we're not talking about if Israel's perfect. We're talking about, is it the criticism towards Eretz Yisrael fair? Generally, we've seen that it's not. But actually, the thing that we should address now, I think, is that while all anti-Semitism is painful to us as Jews, there's something particularly painful about this form of anti-Semitism that we are facing in today's day and age. And that is that so many young Jews, particularly those on college campuses, are getting sucked in with those who stand against Jewish people. Take, for example, the BDS movement. There's a lot of Jews involved in the BDS movement. And the big problem for this, not only is it just painful, the fact that our own people are involved in it, is that it also gives them a veneer of legitimacy, right? If you say that, look, how could I be anti-Semitic if some of the speakers at my rally and some of the members on my board and some of the biggest fundraisers and rabble rousers are Jewish, right? It's like, when people say I can't be racist, some of my best friends are black, right? So how could BDS be anti-Semitic movement? Some of the members of the board are Jewish, right? So why is it that so many young Jews are involved in something like this? How can this be? So for this, we're actually going to return back to the Purim story.
Wait. It might also be, I don't know if it's helpful to also examine why Jews were involved in the civil rights movement as well. Maybe the same motivation.
It's going to be, I think so. I think what we're going to say is going to actually fit in very well with your idea. There's two big stories. There's two holidays that we celebrate about a time when we were saved from destruction, right? Annihilation. We have one that's coming up very soon, Hanukkah, and then Purim is going to happen in a couple of months. The similarities are obvious, right? They try to kill us. We won. Let's eat, right? That famous joke. But there are certain differences between the Hanukkah story and the Purim story. Anyone have any differences between the Hanukkah story and the Purim story? You can focus on the villains, actually might be helpful. The villains of the Hanukkah story was Antiochus, and the villain of the Haman story, what's the difference in their attitudes, their plans, and the way they went about their schemes? Hello.
In the Hanukkah story, they didn't want to kill the Jews. They wanted to assimilate them, make them like everybody else. We have a better way of doing things. We think yours is, a little less evolved. We want you to. You can keep your practices, but don't associate them to divine mandate. Now, in the Purim story, of course, they wanted to completely obliterate the Jews.
Very good.
No question there.
So you have two kinds of anti-Semitism. You have the Haman anti-Semitism. The Haman anti-Semitism is the Jews are no good. We talked about it last week, the ditch and the mound, right? I have this problem with the Jews. Let's get rid of them. It's very hard for a Jew to get involved or to get on board with Haman anti-Semitism, right? Because what space do I have in this movement? They want to kill me. They want to destroy me. Then you have Antiochus or the Hanukkah anti-Semitism. What's the Antiochus Hanukkah anti-Semitism? Judaism is not very cool. It's not very trendy. By definition, Judaism is all about tradition, and that is, by definition, uncool, right? So then you have the Greeks, the great Hellenizers, and there's this movement, a global movement, right? That we have certain values that everybody should ascribe to, and you guys can come aboard, right? You could even keep most of your Jewish traditions. You want to keep eating gefilte fish, you want to keep wearing your fur hats, do whatever you want to do. But certain of these things, they don't make sense. Bris Milah goes against all of our Hellenistic values, violating the. Antiochus didn't want to destroy the Jews. He wanted to destroy certain Jewish practices. Bris Milah had a problem with circumcision. He had a big problem with kosher. He had one of the big battles was over putting a gymnasium in Jerusalem. What's your problem with having a gymnasium? Come work out, show off your bodies. Let's do it. What's your problem? Can a Jew get involved in Antiochus anti-Semitism? Of course. Nobody wants to be uncool. And the fact of the matter is, according to some historical records, even most Jews initially, at least, before things went completely crazy, sided with Antiochus, and they started Hellenizing. They changed their names. There's stories about different Kohanim, high priests that changed their name to Jason, things like that. They wanted to Hellenize. Judaism is uncool, and it's very difficult to be uncool, right? Most of you now are well established in your identity, so it's a little harder for you to understand. But especially someone who's developing, it's very hard to be different than everyone else. So here we have this opportunity to be like everybody else, and I can still be Jewish. I can still hold on to certain aspects of my tradition, but we just got to modernize certain things. We have to edit some of it. Is that so bad? Is that the end of the world? just take the uncoolness and throw it in the garbage, and then you could be like everybody else. So that's the Antiochus anti-Semitism. This is actually expressed, I think, very well in a magazine article written by Dara Horn, page 91. And I'm going to read that out loud. Page 91, text 4.
Is that burning?
That's just the space heaters. It's a space heater.
Oh, okay.
Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expel Jews, at least not at first, right? In the beginning, Antiochus said, come join the gym, and it's going to be okay. He didn't go to war initially with the Jews. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool are absolutely necessary to Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism's success. In the days of Antiochus, this type of anti-Semitism needed those boys who voluntarily underwent painful genital surgery to prove that the Jews weren't the problem, just the barbarity of Jewish law. This is referencing the idea that certain Jewish men, in order to be accepted, they went under they reversed their bris milah, and it was a horrifying procedure, but they were willing to do that in order to fit in. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them happen to find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and time period, but they invariably contradict the specific values that the surrounding culture has embraced as universal. Thanks to Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there will never be a shortage of Jews willing to comply. A good way of actually putting this, you can look at the two greatest Jewish tragedies of the 20th century. You had Hitler's anti-Semitism. Did any Jews get on board with Hitler's anti-Semitism? I really hope not. There's no documented cases, right? Unfortunately, there are some sick individuals. There's sick puppies out there in the world. Maybe they got involved, right? But then you had Stalin's anti-Semitism, Lenin's anti-Semitism. The Jews get involved in that?
Yes.
Big time, right? Some of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution were Jews. There was an entire division of the KGB called the Yevsektia. They were actually the men who came and arrested the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. They were Jews and were proud Jews, but we have to update Judaism. Stop being ridiculous. And actually, the Friedrich Rebbe's activities were, what was the biggest ideal in communist Russia? The revolution, right? So the biggest crime possible, what were the Jews accused of? Counter-revolutionary activity. The Jews, the traditional Jews stand for everything that we don't stand for. But one of the ways to legitimize this is finding other Jews who are willing to, they want to be cool, and become part of that. So today, the ideology that everyone's chasing is the idea of human rights. And there are Jews that in order to fit in, whether it's on campus, whether it's in certain business circles or social circles, all you need to do, we don't want you dead, right? You stay Jewish. There's just certain aspects of Judaism that you need to change, that you need to throw out. That's what you need to do. That's the problem. That's why, there's so many Jews joining the ranks of those who criticize, delegitimize the land of Israel. So, any questions before we move on? Okay, very good. So what do we do about it? What do we do about all these Jewish kids? It's mostly kids, or they start when they're in school, that they start to get on this anti-Israel gravy train. So how do we prevent Jews from joining the ranks of those anti-Jewish groups? One good way is education, right? So now, what is the basis of the Jewish right to the land of Israel? Throw out some ideas. Go.
Abraham's recorded land purchase in Hebron.
Okay.
4,000 years ago.
Okay. Anyone else? A legitimate the basis of the Jewish right to Israel.
We are the indigenous people of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and we have been there throughout history till now.
So the three basic arguments that are conveyed to express the Jewish right to the land of Israel are as follows. First of all, international law. International law. Back in 1917, after their defeat in the First World War, the Ottoman Empire, which had ruled over what was called Palestine for hundreds of years, was dissolved after the Turkish defeat in World War I. And the League of Nations gave the state of Palestine to the British to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It was called the British Mandate for Palestine. Eventually, in 1948, they came up with the partition plan. The idea of the partition plan was that would create two states within the space, within the sliver of land, one state for the indigenous Arabs, one space for the Jews. And And it was voted in the United Nations by 33 to fewer than 20 to pass the partition plan. The Jews accepted this plan, and the state of Israel was locked in from international law, right? The League of Nations and then the United Nations ratified this idea that the Jewish homeland there should exist in Israel. A second reason given for our right to Israel is that it's crucial to guarantee Jewish survival after the horrors and destruction of the Holocaust. And we saw that there was no safe haven actually anywhere in the world. Even our country, the United States of America, turned people back on Kristallnacht every year. Egon Salmon, he was on the St. Louis. He was actually sent back, right? He was sent back by FDR. So, and also the Allied commanders in Europe refused to bomb the tracks to Auschwitz and other death camps. So it became clear to the Jewish community that we need our own homeland. Nobody's going to protect us besides ourselves. We need to have self-determination, a state. This is the idea of all modern Zionism, Jewish nationalism, at least secular Zionism. The third argument is the historical connection with the land of Israel. No serious historian denies that Israel has been the Jewish homeland for 3,000 years. There has been a continuous Jewish presence in Israel from the times of Joshua. Literally. There's never been a time of Israel in history from when Joshua entered the land. No, they left to Egypt, right? They left to Egypt for a couple hundred years.
Yeah, but no, there were still some left.
But not his children, his converts.
No, there were still Jews left. When everybody else went to Egypt with Joseph and his family,
Right.
there were still Jews in Israel.
Mhm.
And in fact, there's a controversy as to that the Jews from Pharaoh's people didn't get along with the Jews when they came back to Israel, with the Jews that had stayed. That they did not get along because they had different.
You're gonna have to educate me about this after class. But the
All
point is, we've had there's recorded history also, the idea of the Solomon's Empire. There's historical fact for this. The Second Commonwealth, there are multitudes of historical, concrete, archaeological facts. The Jews have been there for at least 2,200 years if you go to the Second Commonwealth. There's never been a period of time since then where at least a few thousand Jews did not live in Israel. There have always been Jews in the city of Jerusalem. There have always been Jews in the city of Safed. There's always been Jews in other northern cities of Israel. And while the majority of Jews for the past 2,000 years have not been in the land of Israel, even till today, there are still Jews who do not, the majority of Jews still do not live in the land of Israel. The entire Jewish people has always focused their energies, their hopes, and their dreams on the land of Israel. After every Seder, we say, what? The Shana Haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Actually, if you read the Amidah, the Jewish prayer service, every day, 3 times a day, we mention our return to Zion multiple times a day. So the historical connection between the Jews and the land of Israel is indisputable. So we have these 3 arguments: the historical connection, the international rights, the international law, going to the Balfour and the White Papers and the partition plan, and then the idea of Jewish survival. They're all strong arguments. You combine them all, and that makes an even stronger case. So there is a movement to do what's known as Hasbara, to explain to Jewish children, take them on birthright, take them to Israel, let them see how Israel's awesome. Let's go to Israel, and hopefully that will educate the Jewish people, the Jewish children, so they'll be more inclined to support the state of Israel.
As the virus mutates and takes on different anti-Semitism, shouldn't we also then change this around to suit whatever the anti-Semitism, for instance, human rights? We should use the indigenous people of Israel. We are only because that's the big movement now in the world.
I agree with you, but I'm going to, what my point is going to be.
The UN is a weak argument. Because that's where everybody says to us, you stole the land.
What I'm going to argue is that we'll see that all these arguments are strong or whatever, or semi-strong.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, this is not the truth. And this is not what we need to argue. This is not what we need to teach. And there's a much more simpler, much more profound. It's simple and profound at the same time, and much more true way we need to teach our children.
Okay.
And truth is all of us. And once we're confident in our own beliefs and knowledge, then we'll be able to educate those around us.
Even with the misconception that the Orthodox aren't so pro-Israel.
That's also education.
Yeah, but now you see that they're speaking out more and more, in fact, that they are. You know, and like the last thing where the Orthodox didn't want to go to service in the army and all of that.
Actually, while I was researching this, I came across a talk. Some Israeli general who ended up becoming a member of the Knesset was saying when you get to the elite level of the Israeli army, more than 50% of them are Hesder boys. Right. Hesder boys are guys who spend half the day in yeshiva, half the day serving. Yeah. And he says their commitment is even stronger than everyone else. We should address this. I guess we might as well. I wasn't planning on it, but we might as well. This idea of Orthodox Jews anti-Zionism. Their problem was not with the land of Israel. They say 3 times a day in their prayer service, we need to turn to Israel. They call it the Holy Land. They say L'Shana Haba Yerushalayim. Their problem was with the way that the state was founded in a secular way. That the state of Israel is a Jewish state, is not a Torah state,
Right.
sadly.
Right.
So they have a major problem with that. And the truth is, if you actually learn the history of Zionism, Zionism was meant, the Zionistic nationalism was seen by the founders of Zionism as a replacement to Judaism. We don't need religion anymore. We're going to be nationalists just like everyone else, right? So that's the Jewish, the Orthodox at least, opposition to anti-Zionism. So now the Chabad approach at least is that while that might be a problem, right? Or there was a debate back in the 40s, should the state be founded or not? That's similar to the distinction between a couple having a conversation. Should we have a child before they conceive or after the child is 2 years old? One is a argument that you could have. The second one is reprehensible, right? So before the state was founded, could discuss back and forth, maybe it's not the best move. But once the state exists, to oppose the state or to call for its dissolution is reprehensible. There are very, very few Jews. We're talking, you could list them on a one computer paper, who actually call for the destruction of the state of Israel. There are a few Mishagoyim that spun off from there's a group called Satmar. So in Satmar, there's a small group called the Torah Karta. In the Torah Karta, there's a couple of whack jobs who go and meet Ahmadinejad and call for the destruction of Israel. They're not healthy people. They are not. One thing, actually, I heard a rabbi once say this: you don't need to go and ask a religious Jew what the Torah says, what Judaism says. Religious Jews are not Judaism. The Torah, the Judaism is Judaism, right? So learn Torah and you know what Judaism says. You can't just go to any religious Jew and ask him what the Torah says. You have to learn it also. So just because this man wears a yarmulke, has payas, does not mean that he is telling you what the Torah says. But I don't want to focus on such a negative idea, which also upsets me, honestly. So let's just focus on what we're focusing on. So you could say that if we educate the youth of today, or broadly American Jews, about these 3 arguments about the Jewish people's right to the land of Israel, that'll help them avoid associating with those who seek to destroy it. The problem is, these arguments are not actually ironclad. There's a text here. It's from a woman named Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis Bennis, she's a Jewish woman. She's very involved in these organizations, calling for the dissolution of the state of Israel, destruction of the state of Israel. And she explains why. Text 5. When I was a Jewish kid, we're on page 94. When I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There really wasn't a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodor Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, who was the leader of British land theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes. So if we tell kids, for example, that being Jewish means supporting the state of Israel, but being Jewish is also tikkun olam and human rights, then what's going to happen, which is true, human rights is a Jewish ideal. So what's going to happen when they seem to conflict? What's going to happen when they seem to conflict, right? This Jewish girl, she grew up in Los Angeles, and she went to B'nai B'rith, and she went to Jewish day camp, and she was taught to support the land of Israel, and she was meant to have that and tikkun olam in the same space. Then you see that Israel is colonialist, right? It's a colonialist project. That was what Theodor Herzl said, whether he meant it or not. He wrote it to this man, Cecil Rhodes. This is actually the man behind the Rhodes Scholarship in Oxford. Turns out it's a huge scumbag, whatever. But he gave a lot of money to Oxford. So that's the problem. So if we tell our kids that our right to Israel is those 3 arguments, you could very easily poke a hole in all 3 of those arguments. International law, right? The idea of the British mandate. Who gave the British the right to say, take this piece of land and resettle a bunch of Jews from Poland? That's crazy. Are you out of your minds? That's moral? That's ethics? That's crazy. The idea of that it's necessary for Jewish protection. You could argue very easily that putting all your eggs in one basket and putting so many millions of Jews in one place that's so close to so many millions of Arabs who hate them is not very smart. Some of you probably remember the panic before the 6-Day War, right? You're putting 4 million Jews in a 500 square mile area. Everyone was terrified of, right? Don't put all your, and now with Iran's nuclear threat, don't put them all in one space. It might be safer. And also if that's the whole argument, do it in Uganda, right? Which is actually what Herzl was thinking. There's an idea to do it in Siberia, in Azerbaijan. Stalin wanted to put the Jews there. If all we need is for protection, why Israel? If you're talking about the historical connection, so if a Lenape Indian comes and says, your house on Sunset Avenue belongs to me, are they right? Many people have had connections to land in the past, right? So if our argument is that the Jews lived there hundreds of years ago, so we should still live there now, so we should give New York, Manhattan back to the Dutch, and really they should give it back to whoever the Lenape Indians, and the British, the monarchs, right? The House of Windsor should leave and give it back to the Celtics, right?
No, if the Indians came back and got the land, then let them have it.
No, if they, oh,
No. What I'm saying is the Jews are there now.
okay,
Okay? So
But also
they're
the
there.
Torah
You
says
can't
this
then
is the-
say to them, you have no right to live here.
100%. I'm not saying I agree with any of these thoughts.
Right.
I'm just saying if that is our entire argument, if that's our entire argument, you're not going to win that argument all the time.
No.
There's certain people, maybe many people, maybe even most, but there are going to be people who disagree with you. And honestly, facts on the ground change,
But
right?
If we come from a Judeo-Christian culture,
Mhm.
in the Torah, it says that was one specific land that was given to people.
Okay. So what's the Jewish claim to the land of Israel? It starts and begins with the fact that we believe we have a God. God gave us the land of
So
Israel.
as society becomes more secular, they not believe in that.
Okay. So we're going to address that. We're going to address that, right? So the first thing we need to do, we're saying it has to be education. How do you change people's minds with education? So the first step is teaching people what it means to be Jewish, right? Teach people Jewish, all that stuff. It says in the Torah, one of the things it says in the Torah is that what's the Jewish right to the land of Israel? The fact that God promised it to Abraham and his children. The very first commentary of Rashi is considered the single most important commentator on the Torah. You'd be hard pressed to find a Hebrew edition of Chumash, of the 5 books of Moses, without Rashi. Right, Ella? Right? When we read Chumash, like even we have the books that we use have translated that we read from every Shabbos, the actual translation incorporates Rashi's translation because it's a commentary, because he's considered the standard, right? The standard commentary to Torah. Now, the very first Rashi in the 5 books of Torah reads as follows. Let's read text 6. The very first Rashi in the entire Torah. Rabbi Yitzchak stated, we're on page 95. Rabbi Yitzchak stated, the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah commanded to the Jewish people, which is contained in the verse, this month shall be to you, etc., which is in Exodus, thousands of lines later. For what purpose does it start with, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? So Rashi's question here is that you could have skipped the entire first book of Genesis. If the whole Torah is about giving us laws and morals and ethics, start with the first time the Jews were given a commandment, which was right before they left Egypt, which was the laws of the new moon, the sanctification of the new moon. That was the first mitzvah. So start by the first mitzvah. Why do we start from Bereshis? So Rashi says, the solution is found in the verse, he recounted the strength of his works to his peoples to give them the inheritance of nations. In other words, if the nations of the world accuse the Jews with the claim, you are thieves for having conquered the lands of the 7 nations, the Jews should reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whomever he desired. It was his will to initially give it to the 7 nations, but it was his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us. So 1,000 years ago, Rashi writes something that seems to be very prescient today. There's going to be a time when the nations of the world come and tell the Jewish people, you're thieves. You don't belong here. You're occupiers, right? You're running an apartheid state. You don't belong here. This isn't yours. So what do we tell them? It says in the Torah, the land was given to Abraham and his children forever. So now, and this was reiterated many, many times throughout the Torah to Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob, and then to their descendants after they left the land of Egypt, before they went to conquer the land of Israel. So now, if we raise Jewish children with little appreciation for the Torah and ambivalence towards God, then this point, even if we convey it, might fall flat. That's true. Okay. So that means we have to educate our children in a way where they appreciate the Torah and God and have a warmth towards that. And we have to honestly believe this. We have to give every Jewish person a robust, general Jewish education. In other words, Israel education only becomes meaningful when it's built on this strong foundation of Jewish education that presents the God and Torah as exciting and relevant and meaningful. So is this going to help the non-Jews of the world? Maybe, possibly, right?
How about the atheists, is the one who say there is no God?
Most of the world's population believes in the Bible.
Yeah.
More than 50% of the world's population believes in the Bible, correct? So maybe they'll believe it. And if they don't, that doesn't really matter. We have our convictions and we have to stand with our convictions. Hello.
Potential problem that I'm thinking of, because some of you might know that when I became Jewish first,
Mhm.
many years ago, I was going to the Reform congregation. And in the Reform movement, they emphasize the prophets over,
The 5 books?
yes,
Interesting.
because they say we today,
Hmm.
we have inherited the message of the prophets, and that's what we are trying to, the ethics, that's what we emphasize as Jews, and it's our job to make the prophecies fulfilled in the world. And so I think, thinking about it, that the motivation for many of the Jews, especially the lady we read, has a lot to do with the emphasis of Judaism has shifted from Torah and mitzvot to prophets.
100%.
And we needed counter argument. I don't know how you're going to do it, but it's not saying that Hashem gave us the land of Israel is not going to dilute this emphasis, this passion about being prophets and being the.
Well, so this isn't the actual answer. This is not the actual answer. But if we're saying just from a prophet-based standpoint, the prophets are rife with references to the Jews and their connection to the land of Israel. That's first of all. Isaiah mentions it all the time. Jeremiah talks about the return to Israel. Daniel talks about davening towards Israel, all these different things. But that's not the point, right? The real answer is we have to educate them in Torah also. That's the point. Even those Jews who don't have those values, we have to bring them closer to authentic Judaism. A big problem Jews have in America is that they think Judaism is something that is not Yiddishkeit, right? There are Jewish values, and then there's Judaism. Tikkun Olam is a Jewish value, right? It's a Jew, and we gave a course, I think 4 years ago, about how the idea of human rights is the way it came to the Western world was through Torah.
Right.
There's a very clear through line from the Torah to even today's ideology, to the Constitution, to the Declaration of Independence, everything, to all the people, everyone.
Right.
So that's one thing. But Yiddishkeit is not Tikkun Olam, right? Even the term Tikkun Olam, do you know where it comes from?
No.
In the last prayer we say every day after every service, there's an Aleinu prayer, which is formulated by Joshua when he entered the land. And in the prayer, he says that a Jew's mission is letaken olam, to rectify the world. So many Jews take this idea and they run with it. The problem is the next 2 words, and it's a Jewish value. The next 2 words in this prayer are b'malchus shakai. Letaken olam b'malchus shakai. Now, what is Tikkun Olam? How do you rectify the world? By showing the king its connection to God. By showing the world its connection to its creator. So if your Tikkun Olam is divorced from Yiddishkeit, is for divorce from Torah, that is no longer a Jewish value.
What do you say Yiddishkeit is for?
Yiddishkeit just means Judaism. I'm just using a Yiddish term. I'm just using a Yiddish term. So that should be part of our goal as well. There are Jews who are very active in the Jewish communities and in Jewish missions and in Jewish societies, and they're just lacking in authentic Judaism, in learning Torah, in the beauty of Torah. And also, another thing is we don't have to take it and slam it down their throats, right? A lot of people are going to be hostile to this, right? So invite them to your home and let's do a Shabbos meal together. Let's put on tefillin together. Let's experience Judaism together, like a Hanukkah Menorah, or like Hanukkah candles.
When you get with those who accept Tikkun Olam, that's enough.
Okay.
To them, it seems as if that's enough, and then you do lose the Judaism.
We can't be satisfied with that. We have to educate people as much as we can. That's what we need to do. Are we going to win everybody? Probably not. You know, like the Rebbe was saying, far too in Gullus. At the end of the day, we're still in exile, right? But we got to do what we got to do.
But I'm saying the seismic shift has happened already.
Yes, it has.
In the fact that it shifted away from ritual to human justice and values like that from the prophets. Judaism has shifted already. And I'm not sure how much.
Not Judaism, many Jews' relationship to Judaism.
Okay, they're different.
Yeah.
I don't redefined.
Yeah.
It's been redefined.
We got a lot of sheep leads.
We're getting a little off. We should probably talk about this more. We're getting a little far afield, but
I think
no,
explains a lot.
But that gets the whole idea of assimilation, right?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Those,
why do you think? But why do you think it is that that the rate of assimilation in Reform and conservative communities is more than 50%?
Because the ritual.
Exactly. So it's all the same thing, right?
It's like Hellenization all over again. It's Hanukkah all over
There
again.
can-
the only sect of Judaism that's growing is Orthodox.
Okay, so here's
The only sect
What do
that's
you
growing in
say to
Judaism
that?
is
When they
Orthodox.
talk about like Venice, this woman, say, well, where the hell do you think it all started? Your human rights. Why don't you go to the source? I mean, that's what I would say to her.
Okay, let's move on. Let's move on, and we'll continue. We'll see what the Rebbe has to say.
The
But-
prophets is just
Yeah.
a section. It's not, it's just, it's taking half a book and say, I
Yes,
read.
right.
Right, it says the whole story.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you have to know.
She was also raised.
right.
Yeah, but
So
you know,
that's the
you were-
problem.
you were
That's
raised-
the
She
major
was
problem.
raised as
In a conservative thing. I think that's the problem. I think it was a B'nai B'rith. But
She just rebelled.
the Rebbe wrote a letter once to Zalman Shazar. Zalman Shazar was the president of Israel, not the prime minister. He was the president of Israel in the 70s. He actually came from a family of Chabadniks, but he was not himself religious. And he complained to the Rebbe. The Rebbe never used the term Medinat Yisrael, which means the state of Israel. He always called it Eretz HaKodesh, the Holy Land, or the land of Israel. Never called it the state of Israel. And they spoke about Israel a lot. But he always said our brothers and sisters in the land of Israel, but not the state of Israel. So Shazar wrote a complaint to the Rebbe. And here's the Rebbe's response. This is a much longer letter, but we have a couple of excerpts. I have received complaints. Why do you invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do we mix God into the picture? After all, they say, those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all could proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. The entity established in 1948, based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world, has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim you are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, etc. A claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, the United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it's so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well. We need to emphasize that Israel is not just a land with promise, but it's the promised land. When we take kids on birthright and we show them that Tel Aviv has great beaches, and Israel has all these startups, and the technology in Israel is great, and Israel has a great track record when it comes to human rights and gay rights, and it's the only democracy in the Middle East. That's all fine and good. But we're just saying it's a land like every other land. They do some things good as well, right? So if we're trying to tell these kids that Israel has great beaches, so does California. So does France. And if we put them on birthright and they meet, excuse the way I'm going to talk, hot Israeli soldiers, other, they could fall in love with an Israeli soldier, fall in love with somebody else. If that is our entire thing, that it's a land like anyone else, but it does some things well, we're losing the argument. The point is that it is different because it was promised to the Jewish people by Hashem. Promised to the Jewish people by Hashem. And if we do this and we educate people, and particularly when we put in the context of a holistic, general, rich and robust Jewish education that puts the emphasis on Torah and our relationship, our personal relationship with Hashem, then fewer Jews are going to be involved with movements that are anti-Israel. If we show them their connection with Torah, with their connection with Hashem, their connection with God.
The evangelicals are very, very, they're very.
We're actually going to talk about them next. We're going to talk about them next week because
You can also show them Israel.
we can talk about them next week because I'm a little uncomfortable with them, and we'll talk about that why next week. So now, here's actually a good question that I hope some of you are thinking about. If we claim that we are a faith, right? We're a people of faith, and we are a people of the Torah. And in general, actually, why is the Torah put such an emphasis on our connection to the land of Israel, right? Why do we actually need an Israel? Why do the Jews need an Israel?
Like,
Why is the Torah, the first thing we're going to tell you is your connection to the land of Israel? Why is it so important?
well, like you said before, we're spiritual and we're also physical.
Oh,
You
that's
can
gonna
only
that's
do-
gonna be. Don't give it all away, Jimmy. Don't give it all away.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll say it.
So the Rebbe,
Plenty to do.
there's actually a great quote from Saadia Gaon.
Yeah.
Saadia Gaon, he lived in what is now Iraq, about 1,400 years ago, and he writes, "Umatenu b'nei Yisrael ena uma el b'torata." The Jewish nation is the only nation through the Torah. What does this mean? The Rebbe actually writes this from a historical perspective, in page 102, text 10. An objective, unprejudiced survey of the long history of our people will at once bring to light the reality that our survival as a nation was not the result of material wealth or physical strength. Even during the most prosperous times under the united monarchy of King Solomon, the Jewish people, as well as its country, were material insignificant by comparison with contemporary world empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. To say that the Jews survived because of our material power definitely doesn't make any sense. First of all, even in the height of Jewish power in the times of Solomon, they were, a regional backwater compared to the great empires of the day. Nor was it our active statehood or the control of our geographic homeland that secured our existence, as is evidence from the reality that for the vast majority of our history, our people have lived in exile without a kingdom and without a homeland. So it's also not the Jewish connection to a physical homeland in that sense, with a state, because the majority of Jewish history were Jews without a state. Similarly, so some people like to say it's language that keeps us together, language and culture. Similarly, our Hebrew language does not play a vital role in our perpetuation, for even in biblical times, Aramaic supplanted the Holy Tongue as the spoken language, to the extent that parts of the scripture, almost all of our Babylonian Talmud, the Zohar, and other key works were composed in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Later in the times of Sargon and Maimonides, most of the Jewish masses spoke Arabic, and further down the line, it was Yiddish and other languages. We've never had a common language, or it's shifted throughout times, right? It was the Lashon HaKodesh, the Hebrew, the Holy Tongue, when the Jews first came to the land of Israel, but even in the times of the temple, it shifted to Aramaic, right? Daniel, the book of Daniel is mostly in Aramaic. The entire Talmud is written in Aramaic. Then it changed to Arabic. Actually, the Maimonides, his first several books were actually written in Arabic, even the Maimonides himself. So it's also possible to describe any common secular culture or contemporary scientific knowledge as a major preservation factor for our people, since such matters morphed radically from one era to another. So you can say Jewish culture, our humor, our cuisine. My cuisine is very different than a Jew from India, right? Or a Jew from Morocco, or a Jew from Siberia. That's not, our culture is not what keeps us around. It's not what unifies us. The only remaining consideration, which is the sole factor that has remained consistent throughout the ages, in all lands and under the fullest diversity of circumstance, is the Torah and mitzvahs that the Jews have observed in their daily life with great self-sacrifice. So you have Jews from all stripes, all walks of life, all colors, all creeds, look very different from each other. It's actually one of the things I do in my bar mitzvah lessons. In the first lesson, we talk about what it means to be a Jew. I show them pictures of Jews from different cultures. A Jew from Morocco, and a Jew from Yemen, and a Jew from Russia, a Jew from America, a Jew from India look nothing alike. Our cultures are totally separate. Our shuls, I remember I actually walked in, I've said this story, I walked into an Italian shul. Italy has, they're not Sephardic, they have what's called minhag Italki, Italian minhag. It's no, the way they daven even, the Hebrew prayer book is different than the Ashkenazi prayer book a little bit, and the Sephardic prayer book. And I walked into this Italian synagogue in Rome, that has been around for hundreds of years, and I actually couldn't follow the davening, right? And I've been davening since I'm 7 years old, right? So yeah, exactly. I remember like this was actually a good learning experience for me because I have so many people come to the Chabad house, and it was, I was put into their shoes a little bit, and it was, a humbling experience, and it was good. Jewish culture, what is Jewish culture? That we're funny? No, really, what is Jewish culture? That our mothers criticize us and make us feel guilty?
Yeah, we're guilty.
Yeah, was that Jewish culture? The Italians also make people guilty, right? And so do the Irish, right? Yeah. So what does it mean to be Jewish? Jews, the Russian Jews at least. So what does it mean? What's the common denominator? Why are the Jews still around? It's the connection to the Torah, right? So if our connection is the Torah, right, and the mitzvahs, and observance, and the ritual, and the faith in God. So what do you need a physical land for? Why? So just let me express the question, and then we'll give an answer.
What did you answer?
No,
Okay, go ahead.
What do we need the physical land for? What do we've been Jewish. There's actually I think it was Jonathan Sachs again. I quote him a lot, but I think it was him who said the Ark of the Covenant, which had the tablets. One of the laws about the Ark of the Covenant is that there were poles that were used to carry it. So one of the mitzvot, one of the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah actually, are that you should not remove the poles from the Ark. Don't remove the poles from the Ark. So technically, right now, all of us are fulfilling that mitzvah. Did you remove the poles of the Ark today? Did you, Hillel? I didn't, right? So technically, we're fulfilling one of the mitzvahs just by, it's one of the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah. So what's the significance of the poles in the Ark? That we have to make sure that the Torah is transportable. That when we leave Israel, right? When the temple is destroyed, we go to Babylon, we take the Torah with us. When they come back after 70 years in Persia, they rebuild the temple, they're taking the Torah with them. Metaphorically, obviously. When they go and the temples were destroyed by the Romans and they're dispersed throughout the globe for 1800 years, we're taking the Torah with us. That's our connection. So now the question is, if you could take the Ark, if you could take the Torah, our observance, our heritage, our faith anywhere throughout the world, so what is it about this land that we need the land for?
Because it's our history. It's as simple as that.
No, so we have a lot of history. We have a lot of history in Morocco.
There's lands.
No,
it's our original history.
So why do we have to put so much emphasis to the point that it's the first thing the Torah has to address?
All right, you answer. I don't know.
So-
I'm blank.
So it's actually what Jimmy was saying. Now, what is Judaism? What is Judaism about, actually? Hillel, you know this.
Ritual.
To make,
Not just,
no,
ri- what's the point of the ritual?
To make the mundane holy.
We said actually the Takan Olam, right? The Tikkun Olam idea. We're coming back to that. But what is actually Tikkun Olam? What is the point of Tikkun Olam in Torah?
Holy?
Treat the others
To be holy. What does it mean to be holy?
treat others as you.
What does it mean to be holy? To make what, Hillel?
Make this world.
To make this world a dwelling place for Hashem, right? Right? What is all a ritual? You're taking a cow and you slaughter the cow and you make it into a pair of tefillin. A cow is not holy, and I take it and make it holy, right? Judaism is not sitting in the shul all day, crossing your legs, closing your eyes, and meditating and connecting to Hashem, right? A Shabbos candle, right? I'm taking paraffin or wax or whatever it is, and I'm lighting something physical. Physical light. I need physical light. Judaism, Torah is about the metaphorical light. Why the physical light? So here's the answer. Text 11, page 104. The response to this is that the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is unique. It is not comparable to the relationship between any other nation and its homeland. Rather, the Jewish land is an integral part of the Jewish people's spiritual mission. So here we go. The ultimate goal. What's the point of what are we doing here? The ultimate goal of the Jewish people's divine service is to turn this tangible world into a home for godly revelation, to the point that God's holiness dwells specifically in the physical reality of this world. That you take a cow and you turn it into a Torah scroll, the holiest thing that we have.
Could that be the beginning of the completion of the mission?
That's what we're trying to do. Every day we're getting a little
But I'm
closer.
saying by having regaining that land. Do you understand?
We'll get to it. For this reason, the majority of the Torah's commandments involve physical activities, so that the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvot installs sanctity into tangible materials. When it comes to mitzvahs that are spiritual in nature, emotional, and intellectual, there's like 12, right? The rest of the mitzvahs are all physical. There's a mitzvah to love God, there's a mitzvah to fear God, there's a mitzvah to love your fellow, there's a mitzvah to have faith in God. But most of the mitzvahs are what's going to happen if my cow kills your cow. Physical stuff. Or how do I go about making sure that my physical food is kosher? That my physical tefillin or Shabbos candles are kosher. It was therefore critical. So because the whole point is that we take spirituality and fuse it with the tangible and make whole, what does it mean to be holy in Judaism? That the physical is infused, integrated, reintegrated with its divine purpose. So because that's the entire mission of Judaism, it was therefore critical, we're continuing in the letter, to provide the Jews with the land of Israel, a physical land, and to provide them with an abundance of mitzvot that can be performed exclusively with this land. For this expresses the entire goal of the Jewish people and the purpose of the Torah to conquer the physical dimension of the world and transform it into a world, a home for God. So Hashem wanted us to create a world that's a dwelling place for him. And part of that is creating a society that is an expression of godliness. So part of that is having a land. Part of that is having a government. Part of that is having a place where Judaism is observed in its fullest and its wholest. I actually want to read. I want to finish. We're not finished. We're going to continue our discussion with a story that was shared by Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel. No, Ashkenazi rabbi. I think he was actually the youngest survivor of Auschwitz.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he was, I think, younger than bar mitzvah or just bar mitzvah, and he survived. So he tells a story that he once met Ben Gurion. Ben Gurion is considered, he's the George Washington of Israel, right? So in 72, he got a phone call, Rabbi Lau got a phone call from Ben Gurion. At this point, he was retired, and he wanted to have a conversation. Ben Gurion was retired. So he called up the chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Lau, and he wanted to have a conversation about two verses in the Bible, in the prophets. He was a student of the Bible, and he had a question, and they spent a few hours, the rabbi went to his kibbutz, spoke a few hours about those two verses in the prophets. And at the end of the conversation, the rabbi says, David, I heard a story about you during the period of the British Mandate of Palestine, before the founding of the state of Israel, and I want to confirm if it's true or not. So Ben Gurion says, what's the story? So the rabbi said, I heard that in 1937, there was the Peel Commission. The Peel Commission was the commission that was in charge of the British Mandate of Palestine. And they were trying to decide what to do at that point about the Arab-Israeli conflict, Arab-Jewish conflict. There wasn't Israeli, right? So the Peel Committee was actually the Peel Committee at one point suggested canceling the mandate, getting rid of the whole plan, right? So Ben Gurion at this time was the head of the Jewish Agency, and he was the last witness to appear before the Peel Commission to appeal in favor of the Jewish state. And Ben Gurion spent 3 hours explaining the historical link between the Jewish people and the land of Israel, saying, and he said, this is our home. Israel is our home. And everyone was impressed, besides for Lord Peel himself, the man in charge of the commission. And after it was finished, Lord Peel said, Mr. Ben Gurion, may I ask you a question? Where were you born? Ben Gurion says Plonsk. Where's Plonsk? Plonsk is Poland, in Poland. So after a long period of silence, Peel whispers, it's very strange indeed that all the Arab leaders of the world were all born, who appeared before me, I'm sorry, they were all born in Palestine. And most of the Jewish leaders who have appeared before me were born in Eastern Europe. And Lord Peel said to Ben Gurion, the Arab people have a kushan, which is a contract from the Ottoman, a deed basically from the Ottoman Empire in the land of Israel. What do you have? So at this point, Ben Gurion remembered that he was sworn in the commission. He's testifying on a Bible, and he had asked for a Chumash, a Jewish Bible, right? And he said, "Here, this is the kushan. This is our deed." It says here in the world's most widely respected book, and I believe the British respect this book as well. This is all you need. We must have this land. And now, fast forward to 73. Rabbi Lau asks Ben Gurion if this is the story really happened. Did he actually hold up the Chumash, the Bible, and say, "This is our deed. This is our document"? So Ben Gurion smiled and says, "Emet v'yatziv," which means that it's true and very certain. So he had another question to ask for Ben Gurion, the rabbi, and he said, "Imagine you have a document that entitles you to a land, then you destroy it, you tear it up, you crumple it, and you tear it apart, and you try to give this document as proof of your deed to this land, to this property that you own. Obviously, the committee wouldn't accept this piece of paper. But look at the Jewish people. We pick and choose certain laws. We should consider some laws of the Torah archaic. And in fact, we destroy our own document. The state of Israel destroyed its own document. How can we use the Bible, the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, as our entitlement to the land of Israel if we don't respect the laws stated within?" So the rabbi says, Ben Gurion was a very smart man, and he was smart enough not to respond. Right? So what we said today is that we need to know that the land of Israel is a holy land. It's our land, and we have to recognize and celebrate this. Next week we're going to talk about a change of heart. It's actually, I think, probably the thorniest one. I'm still struggling with exactly what to say next week. How to deal with people in power, influential people who are anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. I know you definitely have your things like that. Yeah. So we'll see what the Torah says. We'll see what the Torah has to say. Yeah. So what we said today is that we learned a lot about Israel and how anti-Semitism manifests itself vis-a-vis the Jewish homeland. We saw that Jewish hatred, anti-Semitism, is like a virus, and we can consider the anti-Semitism of today the third wave, or the alpha, beta, gamma, right? The gamma variant of anti-Semitism, whatever. We also established, I think at least, that not all criticism of Israel is inherently evil, but we have to use, or it's helpful to use the 3 Ds to distinguish between valid criticism and hateful vilification. We talked about how anti-Israel hatred in Jewish circles might be motivated by a desire to fit in and be respected. Actually, interestingly, Matisyahu, you ever heard of Matisyahu? He was a Hasidic reggae dude, right?
Guy, yeah.
So he was going to be part of a concert in Spain, and he was invited. But before he came over, they asked him to put out a statement condemning Israel's policies, or he won't be able to perform. Nobody else was asked to give any such statements about anything else. So whatever he put, so a lot of Jews, they, in order to fit in, they do things like this. He did not. He denied it, and he was pulled from the concert. But we talked about how our connection to Israel is due to Hashem's promise that it's our eternal homeland, and how sharing and teaching this point can change the entire nature of the narrative. And we talked about how Israel emphasizes the Jewish call to infuse the world with Hashem's light and values. Next week, we're going to talk about change of heart, but upcoming events that we're going to be having at Chabad. It's going to be a big month this month, the month of Hanukkah. First of all, this Friday night, we're going to be having Friday night dinner at Chabad of the North Shore. If you can make it there, 5:30 on Forest Avenue. Yeah, Baruch Hashem. There's going to be Shabbos lunch here in Shul in honor of the 19th of Kislev, which is a very important date on the Chabad calendar. There's actually also a Farbrengen on Saturday nights. That's for men only. All the other events are for everyone. Sorry, I'm sure we can't come to the Fabringen and have some herring. The Fabringen, just Saturday nights,
Oh,
The big mall lighting, we're doing it again this year. It's going to be the 28th Sunday at, I think I don't remember the time offhand. You can find that on Facebook. Actually, it would be helpful if you could reply on Facebook to the event that you're coming. It helps us out. And then on Tuesday night, we're going to be having a Benny Friedman concert. You should check him out. He's a very talented Hasidic